from decision-taking processes, where women in particular are exposed to sextortion when we come to paying bribes and the currency change because the one who is asking to be paying a bribe is a woman. So these are human rights problems, really. That's what we are fighting for. And we think that the SDG 16 is not just a sector SDG. SDG 16 is or should be mainstream across all the SDGs. If we have corruption, it is clear that the resources invested in other SDGs will end in private pockets, will not be applied to bettering the development of the people or achieving inclusiveness or guaranteeing gender parity or access to education and health care. So as we used to say, and we have a banner yesterday and in the United Nations headquarters, the enemy of all SDGs is corruption. The enemy of our freedom, our future, our dignity is corruption. So we have to fight against corruption together. And in order to do that and to guarantee that the SDGs agenda 2030 is effective and transforms commitments into action, we have to monitor the advance. And in order to do that, we cannot simply resort to the official voluntary country reports. And Transparency is committed to that and had developed a very thorough and in-depth methodology to assess the progress or not in achieving SDGs. And we have done it in a holistic way, including practice and rules, but not only rules, also the implementation. And we are not fighting against governments here. We are helping governments to have a deep understanding of the real process. We have lots of indicators in the two realms, rules and practice, and that's the thing that these shadow reports contribute to the assessment of the progress in the SDGs fulfillment. So let's go now to hear what our chapters, some of them, have prepared in terms of the shadow reports that they prepare for each country. And we invite you to go to our website and take a look at all the shadow reports that continuously our chapters present year after year in order to follow the progress and to assess whether the recommendations that are included in these shadow reports are really accepted, are put in place. So thank you very much for joining us, and now to the chapters, and Linda will follow on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Delia. I think she deserves another hand of applause. She actually made us aware that the SDGs have a common enemy, and that is corruption. The MDGs did have a common enemy as well, and so we have to work hard, mainstream anti-corruption into the SDGs goal so that we will be able to achieve the objective set for ourselves by the year 2030. Delia, thank you very much for your brief remarks. At this juncture, we are going to have a first panel, and the topic for the first panel will be focusing on reviewing national implementation of SDG 16 with focus on target 16.4, 16.5, and 16.10. We have a moderator for this session, and he is in the person of Alberto Precht, board member of Transparency International and also the executive director of TI Chile. Alberto, we are in your hands. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Linda, for your introduction. We will have a really good panel. It's an honor for me to moderate, and I want to invite our distinguished panelists. First of all, I want to invite to sit with near me Mr. Anga Timilsina. Anga is the program manager of the UNDP Global Anti-Corruption Initiative GAIN. The UNDP Global Initiative is response to increasing demand for technical assistance in anti-corruption from more than 130 countries office and the UNDP programming countries. Mr. Timilsina coordinates UNDP anti-corruption efforts at the global level, including global advocacy and awareness, researcher analysis, and donor and partner coordination. Please give an applause for Mr. Timilsina. Also, I want to invite my colleague, Paola Palacio. Paola Palacios is program coordinator at Transparencia Mexicana, the Mexican chapter of Transparency International. In the past, she has worked at the United Nations Development Program in Mexico and at the Regional Bureau for Latin America and the Caribbean in New York in democratic government topics. Please give an applause for Paola. Third, I want to invite Mr. Isaac Morales Tenorio. Mr. Morales is coordinator for multidimensional security in the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Mexico. Among other responsibilities, he is in charge of negotiation on transnational organized crime and arms trafficking, cybersecurity, war drugs problem, corruption, and other emerging security challenges. You have a lot of work to do, yeah? Welcome, Mr. Morales, and please give an applause. I want to invite to join us our colleague Christoph Kowaleski. Christoph is program manager at Acción Ciudadana, the Guatemalan chapter of Transparency International. Prior to Acción Ciudadana, he has worked as senior compliance consultant at PwC. Chris is founding and former board member of the European affiliate of Partnership from Transparency Fund and an anti-corruption CSO. Welcome, Christoph. And I want to invite Mr. Junusa Zakari Jau. It's perfect. Is our colleague, is the chair of Cislac. Cislac is our Transparency International national chapter in Nigeria. He's also columnist with several national newspapers and has signed over than 500 newspaper and magazine articles. Please, Mr. Zakari, welcome, and a big applause for you. Well, this panel will have want to be more a discussion, a conversation between the panelists and the public. The main idea is, first of all, you have 5 minutes to make an opening remarks. After your remarks, if anybody have burning questions from the panel or from the public, please raise your hand. And after that, we will have a discussion with questions and comments for panelists and the public. Maybe let's start with Mr. Timilsina.
I think I will.
You have.
Okay. Okay.
Perfect. At the end.
Okay.
Perfect. Perfect. Mr. Timilsina, please, your opening remarks.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. And we are often being asked what UNDP does, is it development agency on anti-corruption. But most of you know that TI has been UNDP has been partner of TI since its inception. We work on the IACC, on country level advocacy, on jointly implementing our projects and so on. So more recently, I think we have common interest on the implementation of 2030 agenda and particularly goal 16. I will just like to share my own experience on where we stand in terms of implementation of SDG 16. Based on our country level support in many countries, the UNDP support, and my own mission. I have done at least like 10 missions during last 2 years. I will give you a real picture what is happening on the ground. At the conceptual level, we were so happy when the agenda was adopted in 2015 because it was a tremendous opportunity for anti-corruption community. Although the understanding was that most people are confused. When we talk about anti-corruption, they immediately jump into 16.5, which is bribery and corruption. But when we closely look at the indicator, the targets under goal 16, there are 5 already there, the directly related one. The illicit financial flow 16.5, corruption bribery 16.4, and corruption and bribery 16.5, the effective institutions, the accountable institutions 16.6, which is, by the way, a big anti-corruption target. Then the participation and access to information 16.7 and 10. Then now we have the concept of SDG 16 plus. Actually, if we look at across all these 169 indicators, we have at least 36 directly related targets aiming to build peace, prosperity, good governance, to prevent conflict, to establish rule of law, which is the main anti-corruption issue. Rule of law is anti-corruption issue, together with participation, access to information, and so on. So this is the good news. And Delia already touched upon this, and if we closely look at all these targets, at least the 4 targets which was mentioned in the opening, then another one I mentioned, the illicit financial flows too. So if we closely look at these issues, the issue of illicit financial flows is not only anti-corruption issue, it's also development financing issue. The more money we have, if we prevent illicit flows, meaning that we can channel more money back to development. So it is relevant for all goals. It's not just about SDG 16. Same goes with bribery and corruption. Access to information is not just about SDG 16, it's about health, education, service delivery, infrastructure, like a clean construction initiative. We work together with TI and a couple of other partners on this, and also the cost initiative. The construction transparency is not just about goal 16 and so on, it's about all goals. And I mentioned about access to information already. There is clear linkages. The study we have several studies, including one also from TI. The more access to information we have, especially access to data on budgets, expenditure, and all information that is directly linked to service delivery, the quality of service delivery, the access to service delivery, and so on. But now the problem is not at the conceptual level. Now we are pretty much convinced that anti-corruption is important for sustainable development. Just going 5 years back, it was like a taboo talking about corruption. Now it's a part of a global, national, local development agenda. But now the problem is monitoring. And our TI chairperson already touched upon it. And if you look at these SDG indicators which we have provided, the interagency UN group, we see at least out of those the 5 targets I mentioned, they have like at least 8 to 10 indicators. Only one indicator has the established methodology and data, which is 16.6.1, the World Bank data on budget. Other than that, we have 4 indicators which has methodology but no data, and there are 5 indicators which neither have methodology nor data. So actually we published this last year, the experience-based the methodology to measure corruption and bribery. Is partly because most of government counterparts always say that we can't use TI's perception. We said in that case we have the methodology now. We work together with OECD, TI barometer colleagues, and World Bank colleagues that now we have methodology. Can you use it? Don't keep on criticizing TI's perception index that we can't use it. So yeah, we have done that from our part. And then the other issue I would like to highlight is that there has been progress, by the way. We have UNDP's report recently launched on the SDG 16 implementation status in Africa. The reporting on SDG 16 has gone from 17% to 60%. At least they are trying their best to report on the SDG 16. Again, the quality of data, narratives, and whether they are reporting something which is meaningful or not, that has to be checked parallelly by the civil society actors through the parallel reporting as well. And but we have at least 4 major challenges right now. The first challenge is political will. I will explain what I mean by that. I have been to at least 3 countries recently to do training for our UN staff on integration of anti-corruption in SDGs. And we asked them to present what is happening at the country level. In one country, they have prioritized 200 indicators out of 300. None of them are under SDG 16. So they are also making their deliberate choice at the country level. It's also because you don't want to prioritize something which you think might backfire you. So that been one case. The other case is institutional capacity of statistical office. So they can't really, even like the big statistical office like India and South Korea were mentioning that, Anga, no way we can report on all these 169 targets and 300 indicators. It's so expensive to do that. We don't simply have capacity to do that. So that's the capacity issue. Then the third issue is what I call is the missing middle problem. Most of these anti-corruption data have been collected by people like us, anti-corruption practitioners. The SDG reporting often happen by the planning ministry or budget ministry. The economists sit there and they write those reports most of the time. So we also have this missing middle, meaning that 2 communities need to interact more in terms of feeding data. For example, in Botswana, the Directorate of Economic Crime and Commission is taking the lead on SDG 16, collecting data on corruption-related targets. They are part of that national group, monitoring group on SDG 16. So we need to bring more anti-corruption community to be a part of that national platform or the monitoring group, so that we can have better interaction. And then the final limitation I already mentioned is that the data and methodology. We need to continue our advocacy on this. We are doing through UNDP, through our country offices, that the government, at least they need to produce new data, or they need to maximize, within the available data at the country level. For example, our guidance in the training is that if they have national panel data on corruption, use it. That's a gold standard. Whether it's experience-based or perception-based, it really doesn't matter. Like the service delivery, quality of service delivery, whether it's perception or experience, it's gold standard. If they cannot get that panel data at the country level, they can use barometer, by the way. Barometer clusters country within, in the region with same social economic structure, like Asia or Latin America or Africa. So we are also advocating our country offices and government counterparts to use that data. If nothing is available, they can still tap into the global data set, what can they do? So best ways is to triangulate as well. Take a different set of data and see what comes out of it in terms of monitoring. But we really also need to continue advocacy on investing on more meaningful data collection, and also like pilot testing these standard methodologies to collect data. And finally, we have our new online course through our UN System Staff College called Anti-Corruption Contribution to 2030 Agenda. It's a 5-week online course with webinars and so on. We developed in parallel with the TI course, so these are 2 complementary. I have also taken the TI course just to see what we are repeating or what we are not repeating. Not competing, by the way. These are like kind of complementary courses, and actually we already provided training to 100 people. Out of 100 people, we had 45% participants from civil society. So it's good to know that at least that is also benefiting our advocacy work. And finally, to our TI chair and all TI colleagues, please continue your advocacy at the global level, no matter what they say. We need to continue building the momentum. Otherwise, I already mentioned that the political will thing is a real challenge in every country. Choosing 3 out of 300 indicators, they will choose whatever they like. We need to build a kind of coalition of our partners, like-minded partners, and we already have alliance, global alliance, the pathfinders and other mechanism as well. We have the Praya city group also advocating for it, and TI is always a big partner for us to do advocacy. So let's work together, and let me stop here. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Well, we are working on that. We are really we are really committed to have better methodology and to work with UNDP and our organization in order to really show to the government that we can have measurements for corruption. It's a big difficult, but it's not just to say, oh, we are better. No, we are better, and give really strong reason for that. And thank you, because UNDP are working hard on that. Well, Paola, please, your opening remarks.
Thank you. Hello, thank you all. Well, yes, thank you for being here. And I would like to address some topics. Well, sustainable development cannot be achieved, as we know, without peace, security, and strong institutions. Without these conditions, the Sustainable Development Agenda and its goals, the SDGs nowadays, cannot be achieved. These democratic governance topics, including in SDG 16, is something that we did not see in the year 2000 with the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs. These topics have been historically difficult to address among and within governments. In some countries, these topics are not comfortable, not included as a priority. But ultimately, these now are a reality in the 2030 agenda. Nowadays, countries, civil society, private sector, academia, and communities have the opportunity to work together in these goals and their targets. Specifically, we as Transparency International focus on targets 16.4 about reducing illicit financial flows and strengthening the recovery and return of stolen assets. 16.5 about substantially reduce corruption and bribery in all their forms. 16.6 on effective, accountable, and transparent institutions at all levels, and 16.10 on ensuring public access to information and protection of fundamental freedoms in accordance with national legislation and international agreements. These conventions are mentioned in different international conventions, partnerships, or agreements. However, a common issue that is that in these commitments need to be implemented effectively and cannot remain as declarative acts. In order to do this, the countries should focus on four things that I will mention. First, regarding the reduction of corruption, countries should maintain a continuous and systematic effort in the anti-corruption cycle. It is necessary to have complete and effective anti-corruption strategies that can integrate prevention, detection, investigation, sanction, recovery of assets, and damage repair. Mexico, for example, in the CPI 2018, the Corruption Perception Index that Transparency International launches every year, has a score of 28, where 0 is very corrupt and 100 is very clean. And it ranks in the position 138 of 180 countries. It's the last position in the OECD, and it's the last position, as equal to Russia in the G20 countries. And for example, in this case, Mexico could affirm that it is advancing in the effective control of corruption until there is a real dismantlement of corruption networks that have captured public institutions and that have been politically protected. And the second is that when the debated resources have been returned to the nation's coffers through an active recovery and return of stolen assets. The recovery of assets and the damage repair serve the purpose of having additional resources for the accomplishment of the SDGs. The second point is that countries should translate these commitments and goals to concrete and measurable actions for each target that it can improve people's lives. The premise of leaving no one behind is not working as it should, since the goals and targets are not implemented in a simple and local way. For example, as our colleagues from Nigeria know, in our cases as federations, we have also the challenge to implement the goals in different levels of government that have autonomy of action and that have different levels of institutional strength. Particularly in Mexico at the national, but also at the subnational or local levels, these goals are rarely a priority for governments. There needs to be a clear commitment, especially at the local level, since it's the closest to the people. We need to push forward this agenda from the bottom to the top. If we don't translate the SDGs to specific actions that have impact in people's lives, they're not going to be accomplished. Number 3 is that the goals need to be measured in order to record progress according to clearly defined indicators. We're already in the 4th year of the Sustainable Development Goals implementation, but clearly the national indicators in many countries are not ready yet. The indicators of SDG 16 are the most complicated of this agenda, but the lack of concrete measurements at the country level is a problem for the 2030 agenda and for many other instruments, such as the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, the UNCAC. And so governments, in coordination with all the actors involved in this agenda, need to establish these measurements as soon as possible. And finally, number 4, the social contract between governments and citizens needs to be strengthened again. Participatory and direct democratic regimes are crucial to level up the voice of the voiceless. In many countries of the world, civic space has been shrinking. There are democratic governance deficits and human rights abuses that need to be addressed. We as citizens need to make this agenda ours in order to act and demand government's action towards the real implementation of the agenda. The Sustainable Development Goals need to be for the people, but also by the people. Without listening to people's problems, their needs and ideas, and the creation of spaces for people to directly participate and co-create, the goals won't be reached either. As part of Transparency International, we will continue working and pushing the Sustainable Development Agenda, its goals and targets forward. We will also continue making independent monitoring of the international conventions and commitments, and in our case, particularly in Mexico. So let us work for a better sustainable development. The future of humanity depends on it. Thank you.
We need to be more wireless next time, but yeah. I don't know if you have a burning question, but I have a question for you, Paola, because for your remarks. In your opinion, what is the importance of parallel reports from civil society in that way to push the government to have better measurements against corruption?
Thank you. Regarding shadow reports, as Transparency International, we have 33 countries that have been doing these voluntary reports, the shadow of the voluntary reports, and it's a very important topic because it complements and it mirrors in a way the official national voluntary reports, but they also highlight how the country is doing with the point of view of civil society, and all the monitoring of international commitments need to be addressed by an independent monitoring methodology that could serve as a comparison for what the government says, and that is crucial for any democracy. So I guess we will continue doing this, and it's a very important agenda for our chapters.
To Mr. Morales.
Okay, thank you very much, distinguished panelists, dear colleagues. First of all, on behalf of the government of Mexico, I want to express our gratitude to invite us to joining this event. I won't say side event, this event, and multi-stakeholder event, and that is good, and we celebrate it. We are very glad having the opportunity to share with you some, if I may say, complementary views and progress and challenges regarding the SDGs and concretely the Goal 16. For us, the high-level political forum gives us a real opportunity, a great opportunity, not only to present and to evaluate national progress, but the opportunity to improve the way forward. And when addressing the Goal 16, and particularly the target 16.5, I will say that this is very important, as we have to recognize that more action-oriented programs and actions actually are needed, as my colleagues previously said. And these action-oriented programs or measures will be at national, at local, at regional, and at the global levels. I want to reaffirm that we are obligated, yes, to implement what we have agreed already within the whole 2030 agenda. The international community agreed already a goal 16 with the same level of importance of than the goal, the number 1, 3, 8, or I mean the whole other 16 goals. So we do have this global enemy, as you have heard, called corruption, and we have to address and we have to counter this global enemy. Before sharing some progress and views from the national level from Mexico, let me just invite you all to recognize the importance of that implementation of particularly goal 16. It's not and must not be reduced to the already agreed indicators. We have to evaluate and we have to see far beyond these indicators in order to see if progress, how this progress have been made. Now, let me share from the national experience, share with you that gladly the government of Mexico established, as you may know, a National Council for the 2030 Agenda, chaired by the Office of the President. All national authorities at federal level, the legislator, and representatives now and representatives of civil society, business sector, and academia, states and municipalities are part of this same table. We believe it's the correct way to translate the 2030 agenda into local actions, as my colleagues said. The goal of this council is to align, of course, all programs and policies to the 2030 agenda, and also to promote accountability. We need to go to promote accountability through this national council by presenting progress to this council, and then more to get more coherence when implementing the whole SDGs. Regarding target 16.5, as you may know, the government of Mexico has launched a national anti-corruption strategy. This is a top priority, and I could say it is a cross-cutting strategy to the whole national strategies at this moment. With recent constitutional reforms early this year, corruption now it is considered a major offense, a major crime. This anti-corruption strategy it's based on at least 5 elements. The first element, to give the citizens an active role in the efforts to prevent and to fight against corruption. And I take the opportunity to recognize this element, to give the citizens an active role in order to encourage you to keep working as you have been doing, and actually better that you have been doing from civil society. Second, democratization of technologies in order to increase transparency, to increase open data, and promoting a more efficient interactions, if I may say, interactions between government and the citizen. 3, to a step forward whistleblower protection in Mexico at the legal level and the operational level. To step forward whistleblower protection mechanism according to best international practices and according to the conventions, to the international conventions. 4, to reform and relaunching the public service career with a more efficient and a more accountability-oriented mechanisms. And 5, to promote austerity and better controls of public money and accountability of this public money. Another important element to share with you, it's the idea of when evaluating the Goal 16, to consider the international framework. I mean the international or regional commitments, instruments, our commitments at the international levels of anti-bribery commitments and anti-corruption regimes. We do have to look at this international framework in order to see also if we are making progress on the 16.5. In this regard, I can share with you some recent issues from the experience of Mexico. Last year, Mexico concluded the second review cycle of the UN Convention Against Corruption. During this process, we invited, as we did during the first cycle, we invited again civil society and business sector to participate, particularly during the in situ visit. This was a very, very enriching process for all of us, for the government of Mexico particularly. We are committed, of course, to make this report, I mean the second cycle report, public, and then to comprehensively attend their recommendations. I mean, it's not only to have the recommendations and to have the report, but to attend the recommendations coming from this second cycle report. And finally, to share our commitment the commitment of the government of Mexico to build and to strengthen synergies between instruments, mechanisms, and fora, and anti-corruption and anti-bribery fora. This is very important for us. I was saying the idea of a regime. We do have an international regime. Now we have to implement this regime. And these synergies are very important for us to get a more efficient and comprehensive implementation of that regime, and to better use resources also, and to avoid duplication of efforts. That, by the way, it's very common, duplication of efforts at the international level. In this regard, I finally want to share with you that as Mexico is co-chairing the G20 Anti-Corruption Working Group, last May, recently, we convened the very first informal meeting of governing bodies, secretariats of all regional and international instruments, fora, and mechanisms on anti-corruption and anti-bribery. We were very glad having this Chatham House rules discussions in order to strengthen synergies, and having at the same table civil society representatives, not only the international organizations and the governments, but civil society representatives and business sector representatives, including Transparency International. And it was, I can say it in a very clear manner, it was very enriching having these representatives around this table. I said it was the very first meeting because we expect not only Mexico, but with some other partners, to have a second, a third, and a number of these kind of meetings in order to build in a concrete manner these synergies. Thank you very much.
Questions? I have one. Yeah, you have a really good point that Mexico is part of OGP, is part of UNCAC, is part for the Inter-American Anti-Corruption Convention, is part of the OECD, is part of G20, of course are following the SDGs agenda. And as a former public official, I have the same question without answer. How to put in the same basket and coordinate all the efforts in order not to duplicate? What is the opinion of the Mexican government, and what you are trying to coordinate all the efforts? If not, well, we'll have that duplication of efforts.
Thank you very much for this not easy to answer question. But I have to say that each of these instruments, not only the instruments, actually the fora, each of these fora has a particular added value. And the important issue here is try to map what the added value coming from the different instruments, and it is very close to the mandate, if I may say, to each of those instruments. Once map this added value coming from the different instruments and fora, maybe you can, as a government, you can improve the way that you implement, focusing particularly on the added value of each of those instruments. It's not easy task. Actually, the very first task for the government to do so is to identify what we have been presenting and how we are being implementing our commitments. So I can share with you that we actually, from the government of Mexico, identified that even when we were part of all those mechanisms, instruments, fora, etc., we haven't a strong policy mechanism regarding whistleblowers. So it was a manner to identify, I mean, it was a way to identify that we were not necessarily implementing as a whole the commitments regarding this issue. And as this issue, as the whistleblowers, we have many issues. So the important thing at the very beginning is to recognize that, I won't say failures, but I will say not necessarily progress when implementing those many instruments, fora, etc.
Yeah,
thank you.
Let's move to Crystal.
Yep.
Thank you. So, dear panelists, dear colleagues, and I'd like also to express a particular gratitude to the coordinator resident from the Guatemalan United Nations office, which is here, which I'm very happy to have as a privilege. Well, Guatemala is a small country, but it has made great international news over the last years. I've been working in Guatemala for more than 4 years now. And I came when the so-called Guatemalan Spring was about to bloom. And so there was a lot of hope. There were people mobilizing every Sunday on the streets. It was fascinating to witness that. I got to know a new Guatemala, not the one of fear for the past. It has had in its history, which was holding people back from civic action. So there was obviously something which was triggering this momentum, and this were very effective investigative. It was very effective investigative work of the General Attorney's Office in collaboration with a commission backed by the United Nations, and in this collaboration with international investigators and national investigators, and a very determined commissioner. They had the mandate to target organized crime structures, right? Those responsible for the rampant lack of security we have in Guatemala, and also social development, right? So it has been very effective in its work. It has managed even to get to the highest levels of political representation. And what we are, without getting too much into detail, the current administration decided not to prolong its mandate. So in September, this era is coming to an end, and obviously having still a very strong criminal organizational structure in Guatemala, we are worried particularly about the transition of the capacities to the local institution. And there is one in particular, which is the Special Prosecutor's Office Against Impunity, which has most recently experienced a lot of resistance, and has had, for example, vacancies for the last couple of months, and does not have at the moment the capacity to absorb the capacities which were supposed to be translated to them. And we are also seeing that there are several cases right now against investigators, in particular, and against the head of this unit. About 20 complaints and cases running against them. So they are under enormous pressure, threat for doing their work. And obviously once September comes, we fear that this might impact obviously the high impact cases which are still under investigation at the moment. Just to leave you with one indicator, which is very common obviously in the region, the impunity rate, which has been had at a low over the last couple of years with 92%, and since last year we've been coming up again to 97%. So we have a tremendous challenge and still ahead, and obviously, we are very much hoping for the international community to still stick with us and to see how we can, keep working on the institutional strength of the investigative bodies. So I would leave it with that in the first moment, and of course I'm happy to go into detail of the particular indicators.
Let's remember the gates in the school. Well, if people have questions, and the people that are watching us in streaming, please send the question via Twitter or via the streaming, and I will read. Let's move to Mr. Sakari Ya'u from our chapter Cislac in Nigeria.
It's microphone like the blockchain.
Okay, thank you very much, moderator, and I'm very happy to speak from the extreme side of the side meeting. I'm coming from Nigeria, so I would talk a little about the country and the context. But my starting point is to take where Dalia had stopped, which is to say that without SDG 16, every other goal is not achievable. Nigeria is richly endowed, but its performance in almost every development indicator is extremely low. We have millions of children out of school, and for every child that is out of school means that resources meant for that has been siphoned into private pockets. That means corruption has taken. We have one of the largest, highest maternal mortality rates, and for every woman that dies during childbirth means that resources for that have been siphoned out of the country. Now increasingly we are having a very high rate of kidnapping and violent crimes. Now for every crime that occurred in the country means that somebody has profited from illicit flow of arms into the country. That is the background. Now, it's interesting that at official level, that our government makes commitment, pronouncements about fighting corruption. But the reality on the ground is actually far from what you would expect. The commitments are not matched with commensurate implementation of the commitments that are supposed to be accompanying those pronouncements. You know, Albert talked about political will, and in my country, political will operates at two levels. One level is about selective reporting, as you have said, but also selective implementation of which instruments to implement in the country. Now, we have quite a number of laws that, if implemented, would drastically contribute to reducing the corruption in the country. For instance, we have a procurement law, we have the Fiscal Responsibility Act, and so forth. Now, these have remained paper tigers. They are on paper because they are not being implemented. The Council for Procurement, for instance, has never been implemented in spite of its provisions in the law. Now, if you take the different indicators, progress in Nigeria has been mixed. In some areas, you can point some specific progress, but in many others, you can find stagnation or even falling back than the previous time. Now, if you take, for instance, the issue of recovery of stolen money, Nigeria has been performing very well. It's been recovering the funds from various countries which have been stolen out of the country in previous regimes. Now, the problem then is, what do you do with the stolen money in the country? What instruments have you put to ensure that it's not restolen back to the countries that have? There have been no credible, transparent, and accountable instrument or structure or laws or mechanism to ensure that these recovered assets and monies are properly managed and used in the country. Second, that there are quite a number of laws which have are very deficient. Now, we have Freedom of Information Act, which provides in principle that every citizen is entitled to access information at the disposal of government. But it's extremely an unworthy law that it has, it's burdensome for people to request for that information. And it's also burdensome for government agencies to also provide the information. So it's neither good for the citizen nor good for the government itself, and therefore its implementation is quite difficult and rather not very successful. Now, another complexity, and I think our colleague had mentioned, is about the different layers of governance in the country. You have a federal system consisting of 36 independent states. Well, I call independent in the sense that they are autonomous financially and so forth. Then you have 775 local governments, okay, which all of them with different access to resources and control of these resources. Now, much of our focus about corruption in Nigeria has been mainly at the national level, but at a state level, things are extremely opaque, unaccountable. You know, it's at that level that you see government officials caught on the video, scooping the bribe money, so forth. You know, so there is a lot to be done at a subnational level that a lot of the efforts have focused on the national level without commensurate levels at the regional, the subnational and local level. And these are areas where there's huge resources that are meant to provide education, to provide healthcare, and to provide for other social services. Corruption in terms of bribery, it's difficult to say whether it's increasing or decreasing in Nigeria, okay, because it's something that has become normalized. When you talked about petty corruption, for instance, it's you go and register for license, you pay bribe, you want to register your child in school, you pay bribe, and so forth, you know. Now, it might look petty, but over cumulatively, when you check the number of people involved, the resources that goes into that is quite huge, you know. And that means that in actual fact, it's not petty corruption. It's actually a very big, significant portion of the corruption that take place. But that has a very normative way of normalizing things. People think it's normal, so they do so. And so it defeats the effort of empowering citizens themselves to fight corruption. You know, I think that there is a paradox in Nigeria. That one, you have richly endowed country with a very vibrant civil society, but that a country in which corruption is extremely pervasive, well entrenched, and in spite of the government pronouncement that it's committed to fight corruption. And so if we disaggregate the different indicators, we would find that over the years, Nigeria is not registering a commensurate progress on the different indicators vis-a-vis the commitments and the pronouncements that we hear about governments are making. It's also important to recognize that it's a robust civil society in the country, which is very strong in advocacy and in working and even producing shadow reports for the country, but yet progress is extremely slow in our own context. Illicit flow is still a big problem. I mean, out of the country, it's a major problem. Opacity at the level of governance is still a key problem. Structural corruption has embedded different organs of governance, the police, the judiciary, the legislature, and so forth, have made it very difficult to make progress in terms of fighting corruption. In fact, it is something like, where do you start? You start reforming the police or the judicial system, you know, because if the judiciary is responsible for punishing corruption, and the judiciary itself is heavily implicated in corrupt practices, then it becomes difficult to get justice within that context, and it becomes difficult to have effective instruments for fighting corruption in the country. I think that the mixed picture that I present, it's also what you see at the lower level of governance in the country. Governors are not interested about accountability, about promotion of anti-corruption and so forth. There are only, I think, 3 states that have anti-corruption agencies, okay, which is to say that they are not interested in doing so. In paper, Nigeria have the National Anti-Corruption Strategy, okay, which was launched, I think, about 2 years ago, but its implementation is quite slow and sometimes it's received reversals. In terms of beneficial ownership, there haven't been so much progress, even though there's a lot of talk at the level of governance and civil society, but there have been no concrete progress has been achieved. There are organizations, agencies responsible for fighting corruptions. There are many. They have a tendency to clash over each other, territorial tap wars, and so forth. So make it difficult to even see who is more effective out of them, because sometimes they could also undermine each other in order to compete for resources from the government. And finally, I think that the environment is relatively conducive for pushing more reforms so that we can make progress in implementing the SDG 16 in the country. But I must say that for the moment that progress is quite slow. It's slow because of political will, selectivity, and also, and I think this is the last point I want to say, it's about the political interference at the level of governance. Most anti-corruption agencies tend to target opposition politicians or people rather than being impartial and neutral in terms of prosecution and so forth. So this is a major challenge that the country represents. Thank you.
That's work together. That's that we need, governments, multilaterals, civil society working together. Yesterday we launched our GCB, Global Corruption Barometer in Africa, and I want to give to you some results from Nigeria. 43 of the surveyors think the corruption is increasing in the last 12 months. 44 thinks that they pay a bribe in the previous 12 months in a public service. 40% think their government is doing a bad job of tackling corruption. And 54 thinks, and that's a really good news, that ordinary cities can make a difference in the fight against corruption. It's really good result that. And well, we need to convince the rest of the 46. That's the job of Cislac. Well, now a round of commentaries complement your presentation, and also the floor is open for question. First, go with question. There we have one. We don't have a mic. One there, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, please.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, we don't have a mic. Yeah.
The thing, you can come here and stand. Yes.
Oh yes.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I would like to share with you about how data collection on SDG 16 using the TI tool can make a difference at country level. You know, if we, my name is Ebekojo. So I'm the executive director of ANSE Togo, so the national chapter of TI in Togo. So we cooperated 1 year ago with TI to do a shadow report on SDG 16, 24, 5, 9, and 10. And using the TI tool. And after the collection of data, we organize a stakeholder validation meeting, including other CSO working on SDG issues. So after this, we produced a report that was shared with the government. We met some key government ministers, and we share the recommendation of our report with them. And then so we met with IMF, the World Bank, and the European Union country representative, and we discussed the report. And what is exciting in this process is that 3 of our 5 recommendations were taken by those partners and put in their official relationship with the government. And one of them was to adopt a national anti-corruption law. And after this, we were called by the Premier Minister that they need help how to formulate, to draft the bill, and we worked together to draft the bill. And currently the bill, the anti-corruption bill, was adopted by the Ministerial Council, so the cabinet, and then sent to the Parliament for adoption. I think the TI tool, when it's really used to collect, at the end you have very accurate data that you can use for advocacy, for policy change at the local level. So thank you. This was the experience I wanted to share with you.
Excellent. That's the idea. Work with, no against. And that's the idea of the tool. Please, next question. Come to the floor.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name is Josephine Haba. I come from Nigeria. It's very exciting to sit here and hear the conversation, particularly from my brother in Nigeria, and then to learn from all the panelists what has worked. I am particularly taking it from the last point he made. He said sometimes you want to think, where do we start? Start. Nigeria is a very massive country, like we all know. So that question is very relevant. Where do we start? Because you have some countries that we talk about that can fit into just one state in Nigeria. So their successes are measured as a country and also as Nigeria. I am not saying that Nigeria is doing all well, but I also want to think that we're making a bit of progress. It is the first time in Nigeria that 2 governors are in jail today for corruption issues. I think we need the world to know that. We need the world to know that Nigerians have brought to book 2 governors. They are in jail today. It's something that was almost impossible to happen in Nigeria. Whether it is political or not, for me, it is a message to our children. It is a message to the growing community in Nigeria that someday, someone, whether it is impunity or not, if you did something wrong, you may be caught up with. And basically, one of the things I see clearly today is that court of the public opinion in Nigeria is working very strong. So where do we start? I think we need to empower the court of public opinion in Nigeria. It is today the only court in Nigeria that the Nigerian government also respects, because they mount the pressure to the point where you must respond. But the fact remains that the methodologies may not be all right, but I also know that we all started from somewhere and we're going to go somewhere. I am advocating for support of the public opinion, the court of public opinion in Nigeria. I'm using the means of the public medium to educate Nigerians on how to take back power from the small community of people who have impoverished us, who has kept us underbound, who has brought us to our knees, even for political reasons. That we vote people that we don't know. We vote people because we are told to do so, because of the poverty that these people have increased on us. And so, I do think that for me, coming to New York this year, I'm looking for every opportunity to see communities, organizations, donors who would want to see how the court of public opinion in Nigeria will be empowered will be educated and will be brought to the point where we can take back power for the general populace of Nigerians. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you. Another one, please. Here. Okay, you're closer.
Yeah, my name is Seth. I'm from Cape Town in South Africa, and my keen interest, and I'm just listening to my brother here from Nigeria, is that yeah, we seem to be singing from the same hymn book, if you like, and so I'm really keen and interested to hear how did the people in Mexico actually get their government to do what we all are struggling with, which is political will. For example, in our country, we've got all the best laws, we've got the best constitution, we've got every act you can think about, you know, anti-corruption, we've got public access to information act, we've got every act. But what we see on a daily basis is selective targeting and selective reporting and selective actioning. You know, and that's been the story of our lives. So I'm really keen to hear from my brother here from Mexico in terms of how did they actually get your government to be so committed into making sure that, you know, the whole of SDG 16 actually happens. Thank you. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to the panel. My name is Sheila from Kenya, and we've learned so much from Mexico, Guatemala, and Nigeria. Particularly, I want to maybe react to what my colleague from Nigeria has shared, particularly the concerns around asset recovery, because I think they're the same concerns we have in Kenya, that there's a big risk that proceeds of crime and corruption that are recovered can be easily recorrupted if no accountability mechanisms are put in place. Like, for instance, yesterday we had the Africa Anti-Corruption Day. For most African countries commemorated the day, which was set aside by the African Union. And the theme this year was on asset recovery. And one of the asks we made from Kenya, together with other state agencies involved in the fight against corruption, was that we need to operationalize the asset recovery funds just to ensure that we ensure that those monies that are recovered from crime and corruption acts are well managed. And maybe it would be interesting to hear from the other countries who have, you know, made progress in terms of, you know, recovering the funds and repatriating them back into the economy. What are the best practices? Because this is one of the key issues we're looking at in the implementation of SDG 16. And then the other reaction I also had, my colleague from Nigeria talked a lot about the issue of corruption at the sub-national level, and I think for many countries in Africa it's a key concern, particularly for us in Kenya, where we have a system of devolution, and you find that a lot of the services, particularly in relation to the SDG goals on health, education, provision of water, and others, are mandated at the county level. That's the sub-national level. So how do we devolve the SDGs to the sub-national level? Because I think there's been a lot of focus on national governments, but what about sub-national governments? You know, what role do they play in the implementation of the SDGs? I think we need to look at it, and particularly now, what role do they then play in the fight against corruption? Because we are at a big risk of disenfranchising a lot of the population, because a lot of people rely on services at the sub-national level. So it's something that we also need to look at. And also, just to add to calls that we really need to ensure that aspects of anti-corruption are monitored every year. So countries really need to be obligated to report on corruption. I've seen some of the country reports, and when you look at what they have written on corruption, it's just a line or two. And yet there's so much that we need to do on corruption. I think if we're only going to do this periodically and not do it every year, then we are at a big risk of not being able to meet our SDGs come 2030. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila.
Good morning. I'm Dave Banasar. I'm the vice chair of the UNCAC Civil Society Coalition. And there was some mention of the other international treaties that are out there, like the UN Convention Against Corruption, and I wanted to ask the panel where you think that we can improve those treaties, because obviously UNCAC is signed by just about every country in the world. It's universal. It's as universal as the SDGs nearly, but it doesn't seem to be working like it should be. And there's some areas like around civil society where, for instance, the SDGs was built on a cooperative multi-stakeholder platform. UNCAC is not. It's built on a very state-to-state. NGOs are not allowed into the peer review meetings. Occasionally, at the national level, we can meet with them, with the peer reviewers or with whoever, but it's not part of the process. So one big segment of society is excluded. And can we learn from the SDGs to bring that into UNCAC and into the other regional conventions on corruption? And how can we do that? And how can we, for instance, at the COSP coming up this year in lovely Abu Dhabi, can we somehow get a resolution to sort of improve that? Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. Last question and final comments and reaction from the panel, please.
My name is Ed Elmendorf. I'm from the Partnership for Transparency, an NGO that was established about 15 years ago by a number of TI people. And I wanted to underscore several of the things that were said here and then make a complementary observation. The Partnership for Transparency, PTF, has just released a new study on civil society programs for support to SDG 16. And this study particularly underscores the critical importance of civil society engagement in good governance programs. Too often we have had good governance programs organized from above, and I think that the UNTAC that was just mentioned is a very good example of that, as state action where there has not been a complementary action from the civil society. Without that civil society action, in our view, these programs are unlikely to succeed. We've done a detailed study of the literature over the last 15 years. We have lots of examples showing where civil society action has made a difference and where without the civil society action it won't work. I have a little flyer about it I can give to you. Let me also add that we think the international financial institutions have a new and different kind of role to play here. Most people tend to see the international financial institutions as distant, less engaged only with governments. And I see our colleague from UNDP is reacting very much in that sense. If you look at the publicly articulated policies of the World Bank, the IMF, the Asian Development Bank, the African Bank, you will see that they commit themselves to supporting the SDGs, and particularly they are committed to supporting good governance agendas. I think that we who come from the civil society, I say that also as an ex-World Banker, can hold their policies up and make them also accountable, and then use the international financial institutions as part of these tools to increase the political will. But I gladly continue the dialogue. Thank you very much.
Well, now we have a really big challenge. We have 2 minutes for each panelist for reactions, answer questions, and final remarks. Let's do it.
Well, there were so many interesting, questions. I would say more observations than questions. But let me just wrap up my 2 minutes in 3 issues. The first issue, I think we are so inspired with Mexico's presentation and the issue of this building synergies among this different mechanism, which goes back to the question asked by our TI coalition colleague as well. We have G20, we have OPG, we have EITI, we have UNCAC, we have IPEC, we have, all these SDG processes, high-level political forum, we have African, convention, Inter-American convention, this and that. So I think, if you ask me honestly, I think more is merrier. That is one of the big achievements of our anti-corruption movement over time. Why? Because we have been successful in terms of hiving this multiple networks or the whatever webs of networks and so on. But now we also have to think what representative from Mexico earlier mentioned, that what is added value of each of this mechanism and how we can reinforce one, maybe the main, what the core functionality. Maybe the SDGs 16 can bring them all together. And I am with you, by the way, I am strongly will promote from UNDP with our member state in next conference of the state parties on UNCAC, at least to bring these two together, SDG processes and our UNCAC process. And by the way, we have done that in the past at the General Assembly with TI previous years, and we organized a couple of events on MDGs and anti-corruption. We did the same at the conference of the parties UNDP organized in Marrakesh. From Marrakesh we started it back then. So we are trying to bring these two together, but that we need to do. The other thing, I think I was so inspired when Nigeria's representative mentioned about paper tigers. Whether it be SDG 16 targets or anti-corruption mechanism, policies, laws, there is a huge implementation gap everywhere. There is no shortage of any new legislation or anything. Any country might have some level of access to information too. It may not be perfect. There are all these mechanisms, all these laws, all these institutions. I mean, Nigeria alone has 6-7 anti-corruption institutions. So, but the problem is the huge implementation gap. And and what is the solution? And by the way, you inspired me, Dalia, in the morning when we had a conversation. It boils down to air. We need AIR, action, implementation and reporting. And by the way, the countries will always be selective because we have more than 300 indicators. It's huge investment. And your parallel reporting will actually put pressure on them not to be selective. Earlier there was mentioning of being selective on everything. Selecting on implementation, selecting on reporting, selecting on this, selecting on that. So that issue can be addressed if we continue our parallel reporting and tell them, look, this is how it should be done. This is what is your status in the country overall. So that's why we are really counting on TI is this, what I would call is the flagship initiative when I mentioned my comment on the new reporting tool. So with this, I think the local level, whether we talk about corruption at local level or SDG localization at the local level, it's been a huge challenge, and I think we also need more advocacy for that as well. I think I'll stop and let others to respond.
Thank you. I'll start with the UNCAC question. Actually, during May, there were some recommendations from civil society in Cartagena. And the thing there is that sometimes the governments work separately from civil society organizations. So there needs to be a complementary work and to co-create with the fast tracking of the UNCAC implementation. For example, in Latin America, you can see the anti-corruption recommendations of civil society in the UNCAC coalition, the civil society UNCAC coalition. It's there in English and Spanish, but mainly we can see that there in all these instruments, all these international instruments, there are many the commitments cannot be in declarative status. They need to be implemented specifically in improving people's lives. If we don't see that these commitments are being actionable, are being implemented in particular ways to improve people's conditions, they will be well, a very nice phrases, but not realities for people. So that's one of the main things. And for example, in Mexico, the discourse is, I mean, the corruption perception index has been being less and less in our position, and that's because the corruption has been rising. And even though that we have, for example, a lot of laws that even civil society has been pushing for them to be there, or we have one of the best open information transparency laws about transparency in the world, but they don't they are not working as, for example, for combating corruption, because one thing is transparency and another thing it's corruption or anti-corruption efforts. So we will see advancements in anti-corruption efforts when we see that also impunity it's being addressed. For example, I was mentioning before that once we see that there are dismantlement of corruption networks, and there are the deviated resources have been returned to the national coffers, and that for example, that people have been having better lives with those assets, we will start seeing that change. But now it's difficult to see that corruption is diminishing if we don't see final results. The discourse is very appealing for everyone, but it needs to be put into action. So I would say that.
What would you say the government?
We are partners, actually. That's what we'll say. Well, thank you very much for all your, I will say, not only substantive, but actually inspiring interventions and questions. First of all, I'm very glad of seeing that we are convinced that we all do have to take very serious the 2030 agenda implementation. It is not a wishful thinking, it is an obligation. And we have governments, civil society, business sector, all multi-stakeholders, we do have to say that. It is not wishful thinking, it is obligation. Second, I do believe that the political will, the very first step for the political will is the recognition that we have a problem. In the case of Mexico, I could say that in a very clear manner, we do recognize that we do have this very big problem called corruption. Then the political will, and from the top to the bottom, is recognizing this major problem, and then the decision to attend them. I do believe that with the very recent anti-corruption strategy and the measures that we have been implementing, we are in a better way in order to rule by the example. I mean, from the government to the society in general. Second, it's very encouraging to answer or to try to answer the question how to improve the treaties, how to improve the conventions. Thank you very much for the question, because we do believe that actually strengthening sharing of information sharing of findings between the instruments and mechanisms is very important. Also, I will insist on the idea of synergies. When discussing in informal meetings with the different mechanisms and fora, we identify that maybe actually the secretariats could improve themselves, taking into account best practices coming from other mechanisms. For instance, I will say that the tour de table process in the OCDE, we have taken into account this kind of practice in order to improve and to improve also the time when the secretariat consolidate a report, etc., etc. Of course, civil society it's key. Civil society is key to improve the implementation of the instruments. Maybe not the instruments. It's difficult to improve the instruments. Actually, it's difficult to agree on. It's difficult to have all member states on board. But we do have to improve the implementation of those instruments. And we believe that a way to improve, for instance, the UNCAC, is not only having the reports, but to attend the recommendations. We are not obligated. If we see the articles of the conventions, we are not obligated to implement. But we do need to show that we are committed to implement and to attend the recommendations. By the way, the government of Mexico is talking with the UNODC Secretariat in order to see how, now we're having the second cycle review report, how they could come with us in order to help us, or at least to come with us in order to attend the recommendations coming from the second cycle. And finally, I will echo what my colleague of Nigeria said regarding the question, where do we start? This is very, very important question for us as governments. And I kindly ask you civil society, you experts, you business sector, you to tell us, where do we start? What is the next step in order to better use resources, in order to keep the political will, etc.? You have to tell us, you have to point out, where do we start? What is the next step? Thank you.
I would like to offer a contribution from my perspective as a business integrity program manager at Acción Ciudadana, emphasizing the multi-stakeholder aspect of this panel, and also answering how to use the UNCAC even in this context. For example, we've recently just had an event where we invited business people to show them the UNCAC, because obviously it's not a daily business for them to look at political conventions, but it's important for them to know that part of the UNCAC is also talking about the private sector. I'm coming back to this point in a minute, but I would like to say that the experience that we have made is that the business sector was not necessarily engaged in anti-corruption programs, compliance topics. So when we started working on this particular field, we saw there was a lot of need of technical knowledge. I remember I have had meetings with technical staff, and they were asking what to put into an anti-corruption policy. This is how we started, and over the time we've been now supporting collective action initiatives, and we are definitely convinced that the private sector can be a motor of change, which is not depending so much on political agendas. We've also seen, I think, as a movement, that there's always have been some kind of itinerary process where you have a collective action initiative, when something is regulated as a law, and then you have a case popping up, and all this is continuously hiring the standards of compliance in the business sector, and clients in international markets have another logic to follow. Right, this is something. This is definitely that to exploit. And two last comments. We have recently presented also a law initiative just to show also to the private sector in Guatemala that we want to make positive proposals, also to recognize those actors which work on anti-corruption programs. You know, because there has been a lot of focus on the investigative side. We wanted to show also how there is a way of recognition that can work out. Plus, as there is such a great need of technical knowledge, we've developed a compliance officer program with the University of Guatemala and the United States, for example, also to supply that demand that exists in order to have a strong actor who can be engaged in the entire work that we still have to do in Guatemala.
Thank you very much. As I listen to the conversation, the word political will appears to be the most dominant one that we've been using. And what does that tell me? It tells me that sometimes we make strategic mistake about discussing corruption as if it is a moral issue. I think it's not a moral issue. It's a question of power. And I think that's where I agree with my sister. That you talked about politicians lacking political will. Political will is created, is engineered, and it can be engineered only by the actions of citizens. And I think that it's only when we empower citizens, then they can be able to demand and push politicians to create the type of political will that would help us to implement the sort of laws, instruments, etc. that we are talking. So political will doesn't exist in a vacuum or in some repository inside the pockets of politicians. It is something that we must work for, we must create, and we must nurture, and we must build, and be able to have the type of society that we want. Thanks.
I think if you agree with me, our panelists this morning and our SDG champion moderator have been fantastic, and the objective of the session has been achieved. Let us put our hands together for them once again. I have learned so much from Mexico to Guatemala, from UNDP to Nigeria. We have learned so much from you. And panelists, we are most grateful for the great insights shared with us. Please take your seats, and they deserve another hand of applause. Thank you very much for participation. Because we're already far behind schedule, we will now go for a break. But then we are not going to have the full 15 minutes. We will do 10 minutes. I just want to crave your indulgence that we do 10 minutes break, then we come back. And when we come back, let me introduce to you the moderator for the next session. So we just go quickly into the session the moment we come back. Oh, are you on break already? One meeting, please. For the next session, we will be discussing the relevance of SDG 16 in the effective implementation of the Agenda 2030. And the session will be moderated by Samuel Kaninda, the Regional Advisor for Africa from Transparency International. So my boss will be moderating the next session. Ladies and gentlemen, 10 minutes break, then we are back for the next session. Thank you very much. Was Samuel.
As the Master of Ceremony introduced, I'll be moderating the second session or panel of this session today, our event, and it's an honor and a pleasure to do so. Hoping I'll be up to the expectations of our eminent panelists. And without any further ado, I'll go straight into inviting our panelists to join one by one, starting with our very own Delia Ferreira Rubio, who's our chair. Delia has served as chief advisor for several representatives and senators at the Argentine National Congress and has advised the Constitutional Committee of both the House of Representatives and the Senate and the National Accounting Office. She was elected the chair of TI's board in 2017, and then she's been with us and very engaged in the work we are doing on the SDGs. We know she's a champion also of open government partnership, where she sits in the steering committee, and she was part of the women at TI who launched a movement, and I'm sure we will also be touching on all of those. Our second panelist that I'm calling to the front is Hazel Feigenblatt. Hope I got the name right. And yes, who was managing director, Global Integrity, and worked in investigative journalism for several years. She currently researches the intersection between journalism, anti-democratic and fundamentalist movements in Latin America. So you are most welcome, Hazel. The third one I would like to call to the floor is Rebecca Iras, who has worked for 29 years as a professional. She has 29 years of professional experience in development and international cooperation, working with the UN and the UNDP specifically in various countries. Today she's the UN resident coordinator in Guatemala. You are most welcome, ma'am. Last but not least, we have Andrew Wilson, who is the permanent observer of the International Chamber of Commerce at the United Nations here in New York. Prior to his appointment, Mr. Wilson was from 2015 Chief of Staff and Director of Global Communications at the ICC's headquarters in Paris, responsible for its engagement with international organizations and processes, including the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and the Group of 20. You are most welcome, Andrew. As you will see, in terms of balance from the first panel, we tried to make sure that the balance will need to be done in the opposite direction from the general situation that we usually find ourselves into. So that was a comment that we'll start with. As we know, for those of you, we all have the program. This session will be focusing on SDG 16, but looking at it as an important, and that's our point. I'm a bit biased because I'm from TI, and this is what we are pushing for. We see it as an essential piece, part of the achievement or realization of all the goals. But to get this discussion started, we will invite you just to watch this very brief video which encapsulates and summarizes what we believe this whole discussion is about, and then we'll get the rich and diverse views of our eminent panelists here. And I hope technology cooperates. Can we hear? Right, okay. that's about it. So I could actually say our concluding remarks for the session now, but I'm not going to do that, lest I land in hot water with our panelists here. But I'll start with Delia and say, yes, we are talking about SDG 16 being crucial for the realization of all the other goals. It's cross-cutting. But for some of us who've been with the organization, the movement for some time, we know it was not a given to have SDG 16, and I'll zoom in to what speaks to anti-corruption, access to information, strong institutions, illicit financial flows, to be integrated into the goals. So from that background, that backdrop, what could you say the significance of having this goal included as part of the 17 goals? What does that say to you? What is the significance of this?
Thank you very much, Samuel, and you all for staying with us. Of course, this is part of our success. We have fought for 25 years now. And many people, when I present the CPI each year, says, 25 years, and you present this map full of red countries, 2/3 of the countries under 50 in the scale, meaning lots of corruption or prevailing phenomenon in the world. And I say, okay, when we started 25 years ago, there were no conventions, no laws, no anti-corruption agencies. Corruption was not in the newspapers. And nowadays, that's one of the SDGs included in this Agenda 2030. We have the conventions, not only the international ones, we have regional conventions. We have created national laws. We have created institutions in order to put that laws in practice. So we have the infrastructure ready. And we have the recognition of the importance of the issue. But now we have to go to implementation, to action. And I thank you very much, Anga, for mentioning my AR solution. Because we now have to go for action, implementation, and reporting. And the infrastructure can be better, can be improved in countries, but we have to move a step forward. And this inclusion of the SDG 16 is important not as a sectorial SDGs, as I mentioned. Because if we accept that corruption is there and will be there for the ages, and we don't fight against corruption, the other SDGs won't be achieved. Not in 2030, not in 2050, never. We need to eradicate corruption if we want to effectively put the agenda in place. And what I think is very important is that we are talking about people here. This is not a theory, this is not a very high complex concept. We are talking about people. We are talking about equality. We are talking about inclusiveness. We are talking about dignity. So that's the main objective we are fighting for here.
Yes.
And we need to eradicate corruption because it's an enemy, as we say in our slogan. It's an enemy to all SDGs.
Yeah. And thank you very much for that. And you say the right things in terms of what needs to be achieved. But how do we go about it? I mean, to make sure that the whole approach, the whole work we are working includes those who are most affected by this. Do we still speak to the lawmakers? Yes, we do that. But how do we rally the citizens who are affected and who are more interested in SDG 1, 2, the others, because those are concrete? It means if I can get water, that is something I can touch. If you talk about corruption that is, especially grant corruption, it's far away from them. And that I'll also ask the other panelists, but starting with you. How do we break this cycle of laws being there, institutions, but still talking about the same poor results year after year?
Well, we have to make people realize that there is a link between ordinary people life, everyday life, and corruption. And when you live in a context where you have to pay bribes to get a place in the school, a bed on a hospital, or to get the medicine, or simply to access your ID card, or to access to water, which is just water, drinkable water in some countries, is the response to a bribe paid in order to get drinkable water. That's what we are talking about. And we have to make people realize that although they are not politicians, or they are not business people, or they are not leaders, they are the victims. Each of us, as citizens, as ordinary citizens, we are the victims of corruption. And we have seen people mobilizing in many countries, in this continent and in other continents, and having presidents or vice presidents in jail, or having to resign because of this mobilization. But civil society organization has to go a step forward and to channel this energy in what I call the post-scandal indignation. Because people go to the streets because they are really fed up with corruption.
Yes.
But they cannot be in the street for years or months or every weekend, as our people in Dominican Republic has done for years with green marches against corruption. We have to create the channels for every citizen to participate actively in the fight against corruption, even when indignation has lowered.
Indeed. And I want to bring in Rebecca Arias, because we as civil society have been fighting, making noise to get some of these specific targets included. And maybe just to hear from your perspective, the fact that we have this goal and what it means to you in terms of the achievement of the other goals. Do you share the view that it is a critical goal, goal 16, if we talk about strong institutions and all that Delia has invoked here, and maybe also zooming into the specific experience of Guatemala?
Good morning, and thank you very much to TI for inviting me to participate in this panel, and to all of you for being here this morning. And SDG 16 is about inclusive and peaceful societies, achieving inclusive and peaceful societies for sustainable development. And we see nowadays in our region, in Latin America, that this is one of the greatest challenges facing the countries, achieving inclusive and peaceful societies. And this has to do with the context of weak institutions, low citizen participation in decision-making processes, and also in sometimes polarized societies, and high level of social conflict, tensions. So all of these present significant challenges to the countries to achieve the SDGs. And these issues in particular have to do with SDG 16. So we have implementing SDG 16 means that we have to understand the integrality, or we have to understand SDG 16 within the framework of the integrality of the entire SDG or 2030 agenda. I think that we have to look at the implementation of the SDG 16 as an indispensable, I don't want to say tool, but it's indispensable that we implement SDG 16 in a synergistic manner with the rest of the SDGs. We cannot think of the SDG 16 as an isolated SDG, because all of the issues that are included, or the content of SDG 16, have to do with the rest of the SDGs. Yeah. And I would like to refer to these three key areas that I think we need to be articulated. The first is the promotion of citizen participation, especially the vulnerable groups in decision-making processes. The second, the development of transparent and effective institutions with a high degree of responsiveness. And the third is the access to justice, citizen security, and peaceful coexistence, which are key elements to strengthen the rule of law. Citizen participation to strengthen democracy, when we have the absence of weakness of articulation mechanism between the state and the citizens, this prevents or limits the effective participation of citizens in conditions of equality for decision-making processes. And this affects negatively the quality of public policies and also the democratic governance of the country. And this this is evident from our experience in Guatemala. The dynamics of exclusion, for instance, of women and indigenous populations in the decision-making processes, in particular in the political bodies like the National Congress, women have only 13% of parliament seats, and indigenous populations only, let's see, 11%. And in terms of their participation in the municipal councils, women only hold 3% of mayoral seats, and indigenous populations or peoples, 38%. So there is a persistent low representation of these groups in decision-making processes. And this affects the democratic process and the quality of the public policies. And of course, it affects the implementation of the SDG agenda, because not realizing the rights of women affects SDG number 5. And of course, not promoting a full participation of indigenous populations also affects the other SDGs, access to education, health, and also equality, because we're excluding an important segment of the population. So also I would like to mention that with regards to effective and responsive institutions, it's important not only to promote efficiency, transparency, but also financing. And this is very important, because if we do not have all these elements, we will have weak institutions, and we need to have strong institutions to ensure achieving the full SDG agenda. So effective and responsive institutions is a key element. And we know that in many countries in our region, public revenues are not sufficient to fund social development. And in the case in Guatemala, we have about 10% of GDP of public revenues, which is very low. And public spending is about 12%, between 12 and 13%. So this is not sufficient to cover all the needs in the social areas, meaning education, health, nutrition, etc. And the social indicators are really worrisome. So if we don't have strong institutions, transparent, efficient, but with enough funding, so all the SDGs, most of the SDGs will not be achieved. So for this, it's important that the SDG 16 is fully implemented. And the last point is regarding the access to justice, citizen security, and peaceful coexistence. I think that most of you know this, the World Justice Project and Global Insights on access to justice. And this, the report says that people around the world face a variety of everyday justice problems related to employment, housing, education, health, and family life, among many others. In addition to having a legal dimension, these justice issues go to the heart of people's social, economic, and physical well-being. So, we tend to see the issue of access to justice mainly related to criminal justice. But it's not only that, it has to do with everyday people's civil and administrative justice needs. So this is also very important to ensure access to justice, but at all levels and in all sectors. And citizen security is also very important. We have in the Central American region, in particular in the 3 northern countries of Central America, high levels of violence, and this also is very much a big issue for the governance of the 3 countries. And this is affecting not only the citizen security, is affecting people's lives in terms of displacement, migration, etc. And also it's affecting the lack of, or the, it's impeding access of the population to health, to social services, etc., etc. So ensuring also citizen security is essential to achieve the rest of the Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah.
And I can speak also of peaceful coexistence, but I will stop here because I
Thank
don't
you.
want to take much of the time. Thank you.
Thank you. And what you've said just it underscores the integrated nature of all the goals, because you talked about security, you talked about, and that includes the peace. You cannot achieve other SDGs if there's no stability, if people don't have security as human beings. But because you are the UN in Guatemala, based on your observation in that member state of the UN, how would you, in a nutshell, say, review or your assessment of progress towards putting in place what would be needed to turn the tide against all these ills we are talking about? Would you say there's reason for hope? There still needs to engage, or do we wait for the post-2030 agenda? Maybe there's hope there.
No, I think that there is hope. There is a strong commitment in Guatemala to the achievement of the 2030 agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. The government has fully adopted this agenda and has aligned it to the National Development Plan. There has been progress in some areas. I think that, well, the government will present the report on Monday. But of course, there is a need to make progress in a lot of areas as well. In terms of Goal 16, I think that there needs to be in the areas that I already mentioned before with regards to responsive institutions. It's important to enhance the capacity to fight, to continue the fight against corruption, and also to strengthen institutions to be more efficient, transparent, and in the use of public resources.
Yeah.
And as I said before, to strengthen the rule of law, to strengthen access to justice. There is, like I said before, there is a strong commitment by all sectors, the judiciary, the legislative, and the executive branches, to implement the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the private sector, the other sectors. But there are a lot of gaps that needs to be closed in all the goals. But I think that closing the gaps in the SDG 16 will be essential to achieve the other goals.
Thank you. So there's a glimmer of hope, but a luta continua. So we'll turn to Andrew Wilson, and he's coming from a sector that is perceived not to be interested unless there's something in it for them. It's the private sector. So there's that he needs to shrug off his from that. But of course, when you look at the SDGs as a whole, all the goals, you can for each of them see opportunities for active engagement from the private sector, and not only as part of altruism. There's also something in it for the sector. But how do you do that if you have weak institutions? You cannot engage with credible partners, not only on the side of government, sometimes even with civil society, because we also advocate for these standards. So what is the significance of the agenda as a whole, but zooming into Goal 16? When we talk about peace, without peace, you can't do business, you can't commerce, trade, and all those. So your perspectives on these issues.
Well, there's a very simple answer, which is, do I need to turn this on? I'm on.
Yes.
You can hear me. Perfect. There's a very simple answer, which is you can't do any of that without SDG 16. But I also think in terms of the discussions we observe and participate in at the UN, that there's a very simple problem, that fundamental importance of SDG 16 is often disregarded or simply forgotten. And what I see in the UN is quite interesting, and we also see this manifest itself in other related discussions, in the G20 to an extent, also the WTO, APEC, and elsewhere, that there's a tendency to focus on new and novel things, and ultimately to disregard simple fundamentals, right? So what I see in New York at the UN, and this is well-intentioned, this is understandable, but it is, I think, inherently problematic, is a tendency to look at things like new technologies, artificial intelligence, blockchain, fintech. Let's look at new financing models, blended finance, impact investing, ESG, whatever else. But you can talk about all those things, but unless you have stable, robust institutions, unless you have the rule of law, unless you have an independent judiciary, unless you eliminate corruption, forget about the rest of the SDGs. Your video was inspirational and absolutely perfectly pitched on that. And I just want to give one example of how this sort of fixation on the new and novel plays out. And it's relevant to SDG 8, it's relevant to SDG 1, decent work, no poverty. It's also relevant to the broader discussion which has played out in the G20, I think, since about 2012, on inclusive globalization, inclusive trade. This notion that essentially globalization, with the expansion of international trade, has benefited the few, potentially at the expense of very many people around the world. And there's certainly an element of truth in that, and it's something we acknowledge as the International Chamber of Commerce. The problem is the counterpoint when you see people talking about how do you make trade more inclusive is people start talking about the internet and e-commerce. And yes, there's a really interesting story there. So small businesses who go online are multiple times more likely to export than small businesses who are offline. So this idea of the internet having democratized voice can now democratize globalization, global trade. And that's right, and it's great. But when you then reduce that to, well, let's get more people online, let's expand access to telecommunications, internet platforms, let's make sure the cost of doing business online is as low as possible, you actually miss something, that you actually have to ship goods across borders. So you can be an SME, you can be producing fabulous products wherever you are in the world, you can connect directly with consumers anywhere in the world, so certainly you are sitting on the doorstep of a global market. But when someone buys your goods, whether it's on eBay, Amazon, Etsy, it doesn't matter, you have to ship them, right? Yeah. And this is where the problem of SDG 16 comes in, at the border. So this really is a discussion around trade facilitation, right? If we're talking about making it easier for SMEs to trade internationally, online is one thing, the real world is quite another. And what we see is huge problems in terms of weak, unstable customs bureaucracies in many countries, developed and developing to an extent, and huge problems with low-level corruption, where essentially exporters who don't have the capacity to deal with multiple applications for export documents don't necessarily have the ability or the willingness to pay bribes, find themselves locked out of global markets, even though there is consumer demand on a B2C or a B2B basis. And this is a huge, huge problem. So our view is, unless you actually get serious and tackle corruption at the border and ensure customs institutions are strong and robust and apply proper standards and practices, and there are global standards that you can apply through the WCO, through the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, you will never achieve inclusive growth, no matter how many people you connect, because the reality is customs administration, low-level corruption at the border remains a huge barrier to inclusive growth, inclusive trade. And if you don't care about SDG 8 or SDG 1, though I think most people do care about SDG 1, there are many other examples of how this low-level corruption and this weakness in border institutions affects the SDGs. So take climate change. What happens when you can't clear goods through customs relatively quickly? And there are examples around the world where it takes weeks and weeks or even months and months to clear goods. And that's routine, that's not an extreme example. The result is lorries, trucks back up at borders, and ships back up in ports. And when ships are in ports and around ports, they tend to emit more CO2 than they are when they're on the high seas. So if you want to look at this from a customs perspective, unless you actually get real, eliminate corruption, ensure the institutions are strong at the border, you're not going to address the climate challenge. You're not going to actually achieve the goals in SDG 13. Another classic example, and then I'll stop, disaster relief efforts. Okay? And this is an issue which cuts across a number of SDGs, I can't remember them by number. But essentially, we know members within our network who make huge amounts of infrastructure, planes, automobiles, whatever, trucks, whatever it might be, available. We know many, many companies who make supplies available when a disaster happens, earthquake, volcano, flooding, whatever it might be. DHL, for instance, will commandeer a series of planes from their network, take them off commercial packages, and send them to where there's a disaster. And then what happens, and we've got a paper on this that we published towards the back end of last year, showing some actual tangible examples in disaster hit areas. Corruption strikes at the border, or the customs agency just can't deal with the influx of goods, they can't clear them, and so the relief, the medicines, the food, the water, whatever it might be, simply cannot get to those in need. So the core message is, let's talk about all the interesting things in the world, fine and good, but unless you get SDG right, in a number of ways, and there are 20 other examples I can give you, you will never achieve the SDGs. So thank you for all you're doing on this, and thank you for this discussion, because it's a refreshing change from the UN norm.
Thank you. And I'm still with you, Andrew, just to say, you've said it's like music to my ears, what you were saying right now. But then you are sitting there, engaging the UN, and what's your feeling when you are carrying the same message that you just said? Is it falling on deaf ears? Is it on people who are waiting to tick boxes? And I'm quite aware that you are sitting next to a UN representative in Guatemala. So, but this is a space where we're engaging. But what's your feeling that it's a worthy investment to continue engaging? Because we are talking about multi-stakeholder dialogue. And I believe walking away, giving up is not an option, because you still need to do your work.
I really think it's incumbent on us all, and it's something we need to do more of. So I often, my job title is Permanent Observer, which is a horrible job title, quite honestly. But I often describe myself as a frustrated observer or an angry observer, because some of the debates you see are just not connected to the real world, and they don't start from fundamentals. They don't really look at systems change. But I really think, and I say this to my team in New York, in Geneva, and also in Paris, we've just got to keep trying. We've got to keep bringing ideas. We've got to keep plugging this message, be it on SDG 16, and there are many other examples I can give where the UN system just isn't looking at things necessarily from the right perspective. But I think it's incumbent upon all of us. And what I say is, if there are organizations in the room who are willing to partner with us to send this message in a powerful way during the General Assembly Week or whenever else, we're up for that. We will do that, and we're truly serious, and we will use our networks as best we can. Right now, I sometimes feel we're a bit of a lone voice. So we need to build those partnerships inside the UN and also outside the UN, but I think we really have to use this high-level political forum with SDG 16 in review as a starting point to really start the drumbeat of why implementation of SDG 16 is critical. And the other thing, I mentioned this to you and your colleagues yesterday, very few people talk about the UN Convention on Anti-Corruption. It's an instrument. Why aren't we talking about how we can make implementation of that convention more effective? But to do that effectively, the International Chamber of Commerce needs partnerships, needs help.
Yes. Thank you. And with that, I would say you find yourself in the right forum. And let's continue dialoguing and discussing and make as much noise about what we are discussing here as we can. So we'll bring in Hazel, because we know that most of the scandals we've heard about corruption, if it's not whistleblowers who have to go in hiding somewhere, these are reports from investigative journalists. And if we cannot do without the critical role of journalists to bring these cases to light, and then we as civil society will be pushing for investigations, prosecutions, and where people are found guilty for sanctions. So having listened to civil society, we've heard from the UN and the private sector, if you could share insights from what you are also spending time on, researching this intersection between journalism, development, and fundamentalist movements. So just your thoughts into this whole discussion, because it's not easy. A lot to do, some light, but challenges are great.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and especially for including the perspective from investigative journalism in this. As I think you will see, there are a lot of common challenges that journalism is facing, that civil society is facing, and the international organizations are facing today. So I am going to start actually with the main takeaway that I would like you to take from this today, and it has to do with what I think is maybe the biggest or the most important contribution of journalism to the implementation of anti-corruption reforms in general and the SDGs more broadly, and is the way in which journalism provides both monitoring and important input to create momentum for the implementation of reforms. However, what we are seeing now is that this is changing that model that we have become used to. See that when investigations come out, there's outrage, and that leads to public pressure and to action is changing. In some cases, it is weakening. And the reason this is happening is, I think we are all very familiar with that. We are seeing all these anti-democratic movements in different regions of the world where you have a mix of fake news with conspiracy theories. We have these polarizing political narratives that rather than push for including all populations, actually actively push for the exclusion of some of these populations. And then we have, of course, an increasing intervention of religious groups in government affairs, which then is leading, I think, to a framing of some public policy issues as a matter of Christian values. And so one of the things, so what we're seeing, the result of all this is that on the one hand, there is an erosion of trust, not just in the media, but I think on all democratic actors and institutions. And then there is that loss of outrage that Delia was talking about earlier. So what do I mean is a loss of, maybe it's a substitution, right? So we are still seeing people angry, a lot of them, and we are seeing people in the streets. But are they pushing for implementation of the policies of inclusion? Are they helping and pushing, creating that public pressure for anti-corruption reforms? And I will say in many cases, not. What we are seeing is a lot of people in the streets pushing for excluding certain groups from basic things such as human rights. So what then we're seeing is that we come up with the availability of data to monitor implementation is a key issue. So you as civil society can finally come to create a lot of important information on that. Investigative journalism oftentimes comes up with very solid, robust information that will help us understand how corruption is adapting and evolving, and it's important to contrast with the kind of reforms that we have they're trying to implement. Are they far off the mark, right, to where corruption is actually happening? We can have all that data, we can have all this information, we can have the evidence, but does that mean that means something to the people that we are hoping will have a reaction against it? And oftentimes the answer is no. So I'm not saying there's no hope in that sense, but at the same time, I think that the challenge here, and this is, I think, a common challenge for international organizations, for civil society, and very definitely for investigative journalists, is how do we get through to these people who are out in the streets, who are demanding change, but are channeling it towards things that actually work against transparency, against the inclusion of more groups. So I think I would say that the end result of all this is that rather than have then help contribute to push for this momentum for implementation, well, this gives governments oftentimes and other actors in private sector and others, is actually a larger margin of what I'm going to call the margin of inaction, where they have more room to not do anything about this. And I think that is a very, very big threat for the implementation of the 2030 agenda down the road. So maybe it's important to focus on some of the things that we can do about that, and some of the things that, how do we work around it. I will start by saying this is a problem that is evolving. I don't think we have even seen the worst of it yet. So I'm not going to propose a solution at all, but I will actually just say there are a few things that I think are promising, and that it will be important to continue to explore and work with them. One of those is collaboration. I think when you have these crisis of trust and important reports come out or investigation evidence, because we know it's not longer enough to just put them out there, we need to think of partnerships, which I think Andrew was mentioning earlier. I think an interesting example of that happened recently in Brazil with all the revelation of this, the way that President Lula was indicted and all that. And when the information, the reports initially came out, this was by a publication that was not necessarily as well known in Brazil and that has been considered, is perceived by many to have a certain position on issues. So there was not necessarily the reaction that you would have expected. But then when they started working in partnership with some other organizations that are maybe more well known to be from different sides of the spectrum, that made it very hard for the people who were trying to, and I mean people in government and people in segments of the public who were trying to dismiss this corruption case as, you know, politicized. So this is the kind of, I think, the dynamic that we need to start seeing more often. I think also in the case of, you know, the issue of the availability of data to monitor, I have seen many times, having worked both in journalism and in civil society, I oftentimes see organizations working in redundancy, trying to create the same data sets, trying to collect the same information from the field, trying to push governments to release the same kind of information. And I think it is very, very important that there is a lot more coordination and communication and just work together, because it is expensive to produce data, especially with the kind of data analysis that we can do now with technology, but at the same time it takes a lot of resources. So I think working together on that is important. And I would also say that, this is something that I think a lot of, pretty much I think all actors have been guilty of, definitely journalism, definitely I think it might be civil society, and I think also international organizations, and is that there have been certain actors that have been playing under the radar, so to speak. And we are seeing them now intervening in very strong ways in these issues, and I think it's time that we start really seeing this as the threat that it is, and also as the corruption factor that it is, and blockage in some cases to implementation. Just to give you an example, and I don't mean to say this is the only case of this, but if we look at religious groups in different countries, in the case of Latin America, perhaps for those of you familiar with it, we have a lot of evangelical groups that have immersed themselves in politics very strongly, funding political parties, funding civil society, funding media, and they have agendas that go exactly to the opposite of what the colleague here was just describing. So you were talking about the women in Guatemala, for example. So while you have the United Nations doing all these campaigns to push the economic integration of women as a matter of sustainable development, you have these people also going to church every Sunday, hearing that women should just stay at home. And with all the kind of domestic violence that we know is a problem in many of these areas. So we are seeing, I think in a way, we just keep sort of like not neutralizing some of these issues. And the question is, well, what does this have to do with corruption? And in addition to what I was just saying, the way that some of these groups can mobilize people in the streets, thousands and thousands, but the way that they can change and shift entire elections in a country, such as they have done, for example, in Brazil, as they were very close to doing in Costa Rica, and as they have done in the US. I think this is one area that needs urgent attention. It is not a matter of religion, it is a matter of how it is being instrumentalized in different ways. And so we have to start paying attention to these new factors and actors that are playing important roles in corruption, in implementation, in monitoring, in accountability, and very definitely in the cultural aspects that ultimately is what will help us make sure that even if we are able to put a law in place, it can actually be implemented successfully. So I will leave you with that reflection.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm itching to open the floor for participants to come in, but Hazel has raised a number of points that I would like to check with the other panelists if you want to quickly respond in half a minute or so. She talked about coordination. She talked about now religion coming up as a potential counterproductive factor to the fight against corruption. Any thought that comes to mind before we invite the
Many
others?
thoughts, I would say, but I will keep the half a minute.
Yeah.
In terms of coordination, you may remember the lyrics which talk about all together now. Well, I would say, act together now, because we need governments, we need civil society, we need ordinary citizens, we need the private sector fighting together against corruption, because we are seeing these trends that you are mentioning in terms of populist regimes, which has really taken our narrative against corruption, but not the agenda against corruption. So they came to government saying, we are the clean people, we're coming out of politics, we are outsiders, we are going to change everything. And the moment they arrive in office, they start behaving in corrupt ways and involved in grand corruption scandals and undue influence, conflicts of interest. But they have hijacked, in a way, the narrative of anti-corruption and disguise people because of this, not taking the agenda which comes with the narrative.
Yeah, and how do we channel the energy that comes out of the revolts, the uprisings to lead to actual change? That the change is not the chaos we see, but how does that lead to sustainable change? Yes, Rebecca.
Yeah. Yes, I agree that we are seeing in Latin America that this trend of these conservative groups that are pushing for a very conservative agenda, which in some cases, and they have a lot of influence in politics, in particular in the legislative agenda in some countries, to push for what we call regressive laws in terms of compliance with the international human rights standards. So we have to be alert and on what is happening. But for me, my concern is that we're dedicating our energy efforts to counter this type of actions instead of focusing on moving forward with the human rights agenda and the rights of people that have been excluded from development. So I think that not only we have to work hard to push for the implementation of the 2030 agenda, but also to ensure that the gains that have been made in the countries, that these gains are, that we don't see setbacks in this the progress that we have made in terms of gender equality, human rights, and the rights of LGBTI people, etc. So I think that we have this challenge that at the same time that we want to push and move forward with the Agenda 2030, we have to also be alert and fighting to avoid that a regressive agenda.
Right. Andrew, anything you want to chip in there? And say, yeah.
I'd love to, and I think the point on collaboration is really the key thing, and I'd actually go one step further and talk about collective action. I think what we actually need is to move to a mode of collective action, and that involves all actors, civil society, business, journalism, governments, or those who are cooperative. But I think it is something that is missing right now in the response of the private sector, and we spend a lot of time talking to companies in our network who face corruption problems and also problems in their supply chain on issues like contemporary forms of slavery, for example. And what you see is companies trying to do individual things. They're trying to do the right thing, but their individual action doesn't result in systemic change, and it often results in problems perpetuating. So one response we often see to problems where companies can't deal with, let's say, corruption and slavery, these are, I think, the best two examples, is they cut supplier relationships or they exit a country. But other companies then enter that supply chain, pick up the same suppliers, or take up the market share in that country. So there's no systemic change from the individual action. And I think what we need to see is companies looking actually at working together with civil society, with other actors, in collective action platforms to drive the systemic change, and also to stay in country and say, we will sit this out, we will take the risks, but we will act together.
Thank you, thank you. And on that note, I would like to turn to the participants in the room, just to see by show of hands who would like to chip in. Yes, sir. Who else? We have, yeah, but I only see gentlemen now. I want, our ladies are sleeping. If you are next to them, we'll start with you, sir.
My name is Vuyo Msizi. I'm working for an organization called Social Change Assistance Trust, based in South Africa. My biggest interest, because I can see that, because if you look in terms of the SDGs, it's a defined plan. But if you have a plan, but you do not have resources to implement that plan, I think to me that's my biggest concern. And I'm trying to check whether there is a global strategy to mobilize resources. Because without that, because if you check in terms of our context in South Africa, there are certain models that have been implemented where you have seen Black Sessions and Social Change Assistance Trust came into partnership, strategic partnership, and monitored various departments of the state on daily basis, engage officials about their conduct, engage citizens, collecting data, and appointed a dedicated group of specialists to analyze that data. And that is well documented. One can access it in terms of, can go to the net and access that. Meaning that there are models or practices that have been implemented, but the issue is the resources. Are there any resources to showcase, to replicate such models? But another thing that is important to me in terms of my observation is that one is identifying corruption as an enemy of all the SDGs. And in terms of my own experience, if you identify it as an enemy, when the minute you start to deal with corruption in our context, in our contextual environment, you become the enemy of the community. Because the members of the community have been benefiting from corruption. And you need to find a way of protecting people who are activists fighting against corruption. And if you do not have resources to protect the people who are fighting against corruption, and if you go to the net and check the number of councillors who have been killed in South Africa, who stood and said no to corruption. Thank you, sir.
So how do we stay safe as we push this agenda and the issue of resources? We'll have to ask you to move forward. Yeah, it cannot reach there. Maybe we can make this an SDG as well, that we can reach the back.
Thank you very much. My question is to Azza. You, throughout your speech, you were talking about journalists and not media. I know that the media is not homogeneous. There are media establishments that are set up particularly to cover up corruptions or to promote corruption. Now, do you see, as you sit here, your role as a heroic journalist who is particularly interested in fighting this our common enemy, or you think it's the work of media as an institution? You know, I'm saying this because we are talking about collaboration and action and so forth, so that I'm not sure that it's the whole media that would follow us in this collective action against this common enemy. So I wanted you to be a little bit nuanced about the type of media and journalists that you are talking about.
Thank you. And we'll hear from Hazel shortly. We'll collect all the questions, sir. If you would please come, forth to. It's for the recording. I see.
Okay. My name is George. I'm from Ghana. My question to the journalist. We are hearing alleged stories about political capture in Ghana among the media. So depending on who buys the conscience of the media, the fight against corruption goes up or down. I don't know if you are seeing the same in your, if you have experienced the same, and what do you prefer to be the solution to that?
Thank you. I see the media coming up very high. I think we had, yes, the gentleman, then Apollinaire, you will come right after him. I think from there we'll allow,
My name is Kurt from the ASJ chapter in Honduras. Also back to Miss, I want to say your last name, Feigenblatt. So two things. One, I think the idea of fake news, polarization, we have been victims. Our chapter has in Honduras, and I think all over, and I think you hit it right on, and I think at least reminded me how important I think building bridges of trust are between civil society, because we have mostly been victims of elites dividing civil society, turning us against each other. So we spend a lot of our time and energy trying to convince authorities, politicians, etc., of what we think needs to happen, but we spend much less time, I'm just talking about ourselves, in convincing other civil societies of what we're doing and that it's good and we could do it together. And because of all of that, bots and Facebook and Twitter, we need to spend maybe the same amount of time trying to convince authorities and convince our colleagues. And the other thing I would encourage you and everyone here to not, it's easy to think of the church as opposition. So when we started our chapter, it was all evangelicals, we would say Protestants, and we were doing anti-corruption work 22 years ago. We often saw the church, the older pastors in the church as our enemies, and what we've come to see is that they aren't. That they have lots, like the Jesus, the prophets of the Bible were brave anti-corruption fighters. And the church has come a long way, I think, in lots of places, including Latin America, the Protestant church, the Catholic church, and I think they also need to be engaged as potential partners and not just as elites who need to be confronted. And CNA, which is another anti-corruption organization in Honduras, was flipped over by the Protestant church. The Protestant church has been playing a leadership role in purging the police in Honduras. So I think you can see churches not just in Honduras and other countries, which there's still serious problems like in any institution, but the church can be also a partner in this anti-corruption work.
Thank you. Apollinaire, you have the challenge of asking your question in 10 seconds.
Yeah, thank you, Samuel. My question goes to the private sector, especially. I have impression that the fight against corruption is at the level of public institution, more including as well as civil society. The private sector is somehow not concerned. I am talking about what is going on the ground. So from the global level, what your strategies to bring to the grassroots level the small businesses, people, to consider that the fight against corruption is the best way to make profits. In the ground, this is not the case so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we'll start with Hazel because you had quite the bulk of it. and we'll go to Delia and ending with Andrew because there's one that is speaking to you. So again, the challenge is to do it in maybe 2 minutes and half a minute for the others.
Okay, so I think I'm going to start in the same order. So to the first question, if I understood correctly, the difference between investigative journalists and then the media more broadly. I think this is absolutely essential. When we talk about media, so just to be clear, when I talk about media, I usually talk about news media. I'm not referring to, film productions necessarily. I'm not talking about fashion magazines and so, or religious radio stations. I'm talking about news media, though that doesn't mean that the cultural aspect is not important. And I think what you should be alert to now is that we are seeing a lot of so-called media organizations that are, producing news, but they are paid for by extreme right groups. They are paid for by all sorts of actors. And so what I always tell people that is absolutely essential is just to understand the concept of media literacy. How do you, and this is actually, I think, essential to probably all the chapters in all the countries, is how do you help people in your country be more aware and understand how do you differentiate between real media, real news, that at least try to be more neutral and balanced versus those that have a very clear political agenda. I think that is the key. So you are absolutely right in catching the difference that I made when I don't talk about news media in general. I talk about investigative journalism. Then there's just general journalism, and then there's what I will call political journalism, which is what in the US would be Fox News, and I'm sure in all your countries there is also some of those. I would just also say, because online it is so easy now to create some of these outlets, it is important to keep an eye on them and just doing investigation. Again, what I was saying earlier, there are new actors that we are not used to investigating as a corruption issue, and this is one area, media, where I will encourage you to investigate it, and I think you will find interesting things there. So the second question, definitely we have traditionally seen journalists in some countries more than others perhaps, though I think it's probably everywhere, that accept bribes, others that because of the business side of things don't have the independence that is core to investigative journalism. And I don't think that's going to disappear. At the same time, and this is the opposite case of what I was just saying, you also have new outlets, like the barriers to produce good investigative journalism are in a way being lowered, right? So I think the Panama Papers is a good example of how you had many organizations working together to protect the independence that they had in all countries, no matter how weak maybe the democracy in some of these countries are, and the freedoms of the press. So I think that's important. We have, I think in Guatemala, there's the case of Plaza Pública that I think has done very interesting work that perhaps the more traditional media wouldn't have been doing. And so I think there's also a lot of hope as well. I think it's important for, I will say, in my opinion, not in your shoes, but I think it is important to engage more closely with some of these outlets and have a very clear picture in your countries of what is the landscape of who's publishing what and why, and what opportunities are there. And then in terms of the building bridges of trust that I think gentleman from Honduras was discussing, I think this is obviously essential. Like I was just saying, like engage with with journalists. I will say, however, that you have to be very, very aware to one reality now, and is that when we talk about civil society and we distinguish them from elites, these narratives, whether they can be used to oppose the implementation of some of these, whether it's anti-corruption goals or others, not only come from elites as we traditionally understand them, they are now coming also from other civil society groups like yourselves who have very opposite agendas. So I have seen cases, for example, I think in the UK, where there are groups who are very actively promoting, for against women's rights, right? So, and they are organized, they have their talking points, they have their, lobbying very well organized. So this is no longer about elites. When we are opening these gates to civil society organizations, there are all sorts of civil society organizations. I think the US is a great example of how there are white supremacy groups that are better organized than some anti-corruption groups. And I think that's something to keep in mind. And then I will close by saying that the issue of religion is tricky usually, because I think it touches on, for some people, it touches on their beliefs. And I think there's this important distinction that we need to start teaching people to make. there is the religious concept as a whole, and then there's religious groups, and then there's the instrumentalization of those groups for economic and political purposes. Some groups, some religious groups, whether these are churches, political parties, or simple religious or civil society organizations, some will be going literally for drug dealing and things of that nature. Others will be literally involved in human trafficking, and others can be, as you were saying, great allies in the fight against corruption. So I think the problem is that when we talk about Christian groups, at least in Latin America, there is this perception of good people, and I think that is not necessarily the case. We have to just be very smart about it. One thing I will say though, and is that even if we can have great allies from some religious groups and organizations, and they may be funding millions to groups in Latin America, in civil society, in political parties, that may seem like useful. At the end of the day, there is a cost to that, because we may be making progress with them against corruption, but they come with conditions, for example, against the rights of women. So that is something that we have to be, I think we have a responsibility as journalists, as civil society, as international organizations, to understand that religion is still, in most cases, still have that bias against women's rights. And that is something that if we're talking about inclusion, is not compatible, and then that has to be negotiated very carefully.
Thank you. Delia, your final thoughts.
Thank you, Samuel. I would take your question. When we talk about the enemy, we are not creating a kind of fight in your community. We are saying metaphorically that this is a problem when we try to achieve all others SDGs, and when we try to defend democracy and to defend participation, inclusiveness, etc., etc. This is a barrier, this is a problem that we have to solve. But you have a very good point in defending civic space, because in many countries in the world, what we are seeing in parallel with these populist approaches is that there is a tendency to shrink the space for civil society and to curtail our capacity to access to information and to exert our work in freedom of association, in defending participation and inclusiveness. And we have to defend the space for civic society in all areas. Journalism, other actors playing a special position in the fight for freedom in general and for dignity, because that's what we are risking. If we shrink or accept this reduction of the space for civic society, we will face very, very hard moments ahead. And we are facing that in East European countries, in America, in Africa, in Asia. And we have to act collectively and to stay together to defend the space for civic society.
Thank you. Thank you. Rebecca?
Yeah, I will follow up on the last point that Delia made with regards to the importance of ensuring the space for civil society, because it is true that it is shrinking, and in some countries they are pushing for laws, like in the Guatemalan case, to regulate the activities of civil society, to exert more control on civil society's activities. And this is because governments don't want to be scrutinized, monitored, etc. And this has to do also with the fight against corruption, with the fights for human rights. So it is important, and so I agree that we need to protect the space for civil society, protect the organizations that fight against corruption, organizations that protect human rights, etc. And we have seen a lot of attacks against organizations that protect human rights or defend human rights, or human rights defenders in Guatemala in recent years, and against also the entire civil society community. So this is very important, as Delia said. We have to be together and work in a more coordinated manner also to support the work that the civil society is doing. And I would like to refer also to the issue of resources that one of the persons that made a question was made on that. This is really an important issue, because if countries do not have the resources to implement the Agenda 2030, this will not be achieved. And the fact is that countries in Latin America, countries have a very low tax collection, revenue from tax collection, so they cannot invest in the Agenda 2030 as needed, as it is required. With most countries, on average, have like between 18-20% of GDP tax collection as a percentage of GDP. In Guatemala, it's about 10%. It's half. So how can the government invest in strengthening institutions, invest in education, health, nutrition, etc.? It's not possible. So on the one hand, the governments have to collect more taxes, but on the other hand, they have to ensure that the resources are used in a transparent manner. It's not only about increasing resources, but also about making the best use of the resources with transparency, efficiency, etc. So this is something that we need to really work a lot on, because, and also the alliances or partnerships with the private sector, with the civil society, these are important, because the private sector is also is a strong partner that can invest also a lot in the sustainable development goals. And I'm happy that in Guatemala I have seen a recent change in the private sector, because they are more interested now in the Agenda 2030, and they want to also adopt a methodology to measure their contribution to the SDGs and develop indicators, etc. So I think that this is good. But we also have to ensure that the private sector makes a significant contribution to the SDGs, not only under the social responsibility approach that some of the organizations or foundations of the private sector have, that they do it more with this assistantialist view, but with a view to invest in a more significant manner, looking at the SDGs also as a way to do good business, right? Yeah. It's a good business also for the private sector to invest more on the SDGs. The more educated, the more healthy are the population, they will be, also they will be better consumers, so they will, of course, have more income, and businesses will grow. So I think that it's also, from the business point of view, it's also good to invest in the SDGs. So we cannot think that the investment in the SDGs can come only from the government, but also from the private sector as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And there's no better way to transition to that. Let's hear from the private sector. What are your final thoughts?
Super. So the question on the local private sector, what happens actually on the ground? I think it's the million-dollar question. And I think it's a brilliant question, quite frankly. And I think that, let me try to answer it in two different ways. So the conceptual, and this just doesn't apply to anti-corruption, it applies across the SDGs. There's an absolute disconnect between the discussions you hear at the UN, here in New York, and in other global forums about the SDGs and what happens on the ground. Despite all the communications efforts, despite all the branding efforts, despite efforts from ICC, local chambers, the Global Compact, whoever, there hasn't been the cut-through. And I'll give you one crude metric, but I think it's instructive in illustrating the problem. 3 weeks ago, we had a major conference for local chambers of commerce, SMEs. We had representatives from, I think, about 130 countries, around 2,000 delegates. I was asked to open up the first panel of the main plenary, so probably 1,500 people in the room, on the SDGs, right? So we were trying to show our commitment as a global institution to the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Agenda. 9 a.m. on a Friday morning, I hadn't really prepared, and I thought I'll open up with a really easy one. and I'll say, who in the audience knows anything about the Sustainable Development Goals? And I expected everyone to put their hand up and to say, oh, well, that's great, I don't have to explain what they are. I asked the question, less than a quarter of people put their hands up. And many people looked mystified about what I was talking about and what these icons on the screen at the back were. So there's a conceptual problem that we don't get the cut through, and we need to work out why that's happening and why we're not getting to market. And the reality on corruption is, we've been producing anti-corruption toolkits, I think, since the 1960s. There's the TI guidelines. They're somehow not working at the local level. And the question we've been asking internally very seriously for the past 6-7 months is it a problem of content? Do we not have the right content? Or is it a problem of delivery? So are we not using the right networks or the right delivery mechanisms? So we're now trying to build out some revised guidance and practical things smaller businesses can work with. We're looking at using our ICC Academy for the first time to deploy anti-corruption training and maybe working with local partners to make sure it gets to the right people. But I think we have to look at this very, very seriously and recognize what we've been doing hasn't really got the cut through at the local grassroots level, which is vital. The second thing I'd say, I have to say this personally, because if I say this institutionally, I'll get into a huge amount of trouble, probably lose my job. I think we also need to look, when we talk about small businesses, at supply chains. Many smaller businesses within our network sit within some kind of multinational supply chain. Major corporations tell us, and I think they tell us honestly but somewhat naively, that they're doing all they can to eliminate corruption through the supply chain. The reality is, if you look at the tools they're using, if you look at the third-party auditing they're using, it's not working, it's not actually solving problems, and actually it's just, I was going to use a bad term, I won't, it's providing risk mitigation at the top of the supply chain, not solving local problems. There are some companies who are doing things differently. They're trying to go right through the supply chain, have honest discussions with suppliers, and actually look at fixing problems. That, I think, is an honest approach that has a lot of potential. It's a very different one from the 90% of companies we see who talk about risk mitigation, third-party auditing. But I think that's a conversation that needs to be had.
Absolutely.
Carefully. It's a difficult one. But I think the key thing is, from the bottom up, is what we're providing local businesses the right kind of thing? And are we using the right networks to actually reach them, to tell them how they can deal with the problem of corruption?
Thank you very much, and a round of applause to our panelists. And thanks to you for bearing with us. I know we've gone a little bit over time, but my conclusion will only be that from what we've heard, indeed, all SDGs have a common enemy, but they come with a common opportunity for all of us to be part of change. And we have the different actors on the table. This discussion needs to continue, as you said, Andrew, and we heard about coordination, collaboration, the resources are there. How do we make sure that they achieve the intended purpose and they reach the beneficiaries? All those are the thoughts that we will be taking to lunch as we attend to SDG 2. But that's not my role. I'll invite the Masters of Ceremony to take back the floor. And thanks again to my panelists. I'll ask you to stay for a group photo before we dash off. Over to you, Linda. Thank you.
I think we can do it better. They've done a marvelous job. Moderator Samuel, my boss from TI, and all the panelists. Thank you very much. So you stay here for your group photograph. But I have some announcements. The main one is that as we leave this hall, we are going for lunch. Do not leave us. The lunch has been put together for us, and we need to stay and take the lunch. We also have to say a very big thank you to the organizers of the forum. Special mention goes to Jessica Ebrard. She needs to stand up for us to clap for her. So, she's a coordinator, program coordinator from Transparency International, and also to our TI chapter in Nigeria and in the US. Chioma and your team, thank you very much for the good. Okay, so then we leave this place with one, is that an acronym or word, whatever it is? A, action, implementation, and reporting. This is coming from the chair of Transparency International, Delia. Thank you very much for the new word that you gave us. On that note, we say thank you for coming, and we are grateful. Maybe next year you'll meet us here, but having a very big forum and many, many people attending. Thank you very much. Yes.